QSO Today, episode 414, Joe Long, WA2EJT. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts Magazine. A few notes before we get started today. We now have over 40 exciting presentations for the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming September 17th and 18th. Tickets for the expo are $10 and are on sale now for this event. We offer a scholarship program for kids and qualified students. If you have a project that you'd like to share in the expo without preparing a speaker presentation, then look no further than our new project gallery that includes self-service kiosks for your paper, article, poster, video, and downloadable content. This is a great way to share or seek attention to your project. Click on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo banner in this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for WA2EJT, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Joe Long, WA2EJT, has been a frequent contributor to ham radio magazines for decades, including 73 Magazine and Electric Radio Magazine. Joe has a love for vintage military transmitters and receivers, as well as the best tube-type rigs. Like many hams of his generation, he was early into computers, PCs, and programming, where his knowledge contributed to his career advancement and his enjoyment of amateur radio. WEJT tells his story in this QSO Today. WA2EJT, this is Eric for WA2EJT. Are you there, Joe?
Hello, Eric. Yes, I'm here and ready to go.
Joe, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it's a long time ago now, in the late 1950s, and I think the way that it started was that as a young kid, my parents bought us an encyclopedia, the Book of Knowledge, and somehow I found in there an article on early radio, and there was a radio in there that was used by soldiers during World War I in the trenches, called a foxhole radio. And it didn't use a crystal diode or anything like that. It used a blue-type razor blade and a pin to make the semiconductor contact, and there was some kind of coil of wire and a headset. And I remember being fascinated by that and spending who knows how long trying to build one, and I don't think I ever actually made it work, but that's where the seed was planted, I think, right there.
Now, could you get a blue razor blade in the 50s?
Oh, yeah. I think my dad they were Gillette blue blades, and I think I got one from him.
So the blue was some kind of anodizing, perhaps, on the blade itself.
Yeah, and then a safety pin in contact with that, if you fiddled around with it and moved it around, apparently would give you a junction. But like I said, I don't recall that I ever actually made it work, but I sure had a lot of fun trying.
So what did you do after that?
Well, after that, within probably a fairly short period of time, one of my brothers, who was also interested in electricity and stuff like that, and I heard from, I think my parents told us about it, that there was a local ham club who was running ham radio classes at a Naval Reserve training center that was within walking distance of where we lived. And my mother, I think it was my mother that talked to us about it, wondered, would we be interested in, going and learning about ham radio? And so we both said yes, and it turned out that my brother, after not too long, lost interest in it and dropped out. But I stuck with it, and it was a case of ham club running code, teaching Morse code, and running classes on the theory that you needed for, for a novice class license. And that was where I got my start. And one of the interesting things that I recall clearly was that this Naval Reserve Training Center was set up for training in radio operators and techs, I suppose. And there were a couple of rooms in the training center that we were supposed to go to, and the rest was sort of off limits, I think. But I remember discovering that one of the rooms was quite a great big area. It was all full of radio equipment that I now recognize was, World War II vintage stuff. And I don't recall what all it was, but it was sort of dimly lit, and here was a whole room full of receivers and probably transmitters and who knows what else. And that's probably what sparked my later interest in military equipment.
Plus, it had a very unique smell.
I can't say that I remember the smell right now, but I'm sure that it did. And the main smell that I associate with radio now is, well, of course, opening up a vintage set, and there's a certain unmistakable smell of varnish and oil and that sort of thing that you get out of it.
Right. Where was the hometown?
This was in Binghamton, New York.
Oh, so in the same place that you're in now.
Yeah, I happened when I was looking for work after I got out of college that the job that I found and that I decided that I wanted was right back here in my hometown.
And the Naval Reserve Training Center, was that part of a larger operation, or did that just happen to be a local depot?
Well, I think that's, as far as I know, that's all there was to it. As a kid, you didn't think much about the significance of the place. It was just a sort of a low building and a couple of huge masts outside with lots of antennas on the top. But as a kid, I never thought anything about the significance of the training center, and after I got my license, I never really thought about it again until years later. I thought, I wonder what the story is on that. And so I drove by, and it was gone. It had been demolished and all the antennas and masts taken down. So I never did learn anything more about it than the little bit that I saw as a 14-year-old kid.
You got your first license as a 14-year-old from that same class?
Yep, that's right. I was WA2EJT. That was the novice designation, and which when I upgraded my license became WA2EJT, and I just kept that call all these years.
And what year was that you got your first license?
That was in 1959.
Did you become involved in the amateur radio club there?
No, I was never, not really involved. I attended a couple of field day exercises with guys who were in the club, but I was never particularly interested in radio clubs or any of the stuff that was associated with that.
So it wasn't important to you to be part of a radio group? Did you have friends that came out of the class at the same time that perhaps were the same age as you were?
Yes. As a matter of fact, one of my good friends was WV2EJS. Ron McLean was his name. He unfortunately just died recently. He became an avid DXer and had worked hundreds of 364 countries, I think, something like that, and got a new call sign. For some reason, I remember it, W2VO, and was just an avid DXer.
That was a lifelong friendship that you developed out of that beginning.
Yes, that's right. I saw Ron last year at a local Hamfest, and the next thing I knew, I saw him listed in QST as a silent key.
But you're talking 60 plus years?
Well, that's right. That's a more advanced arithmetic that I want to do these days.
Yeah, me too. How did ham radio proceed for you in your teenage years? I know from the many interviews that I've done that ham radio was quite popular around the country at that time, and that perhaps a lot of public schools actually had ham radio stations. How did that play out for you?
Well, the way it played out for me was that my mother had said, and it was my mother, not my dad, but my mother had said, if you stick with that and get a license, we will buy you a transmitter, some equipment. And they stuck to that, and they bought me a Heathkit receiver, the AR3, with the cabinet. That was a few dollars extra, and a Heathkit DX20 transmitter. And as a 14-year-old kid, I built those. I didn't really know anything about, electronics really, or building stuff like that. But my father didn't really help me, but he was an industrial arts teacher, a shop teacher. And so he knew, enough electricity and electronics to teach electric shop class and there was also wood shop and metal shop. But I built the receiver independently and the transmitter. The receiver, when I built it, didn't work. But my dad knew another shop teacher who, Mr. Gorgas was his name. He was a ham, and we took the receiver to Mr. Gorgas, and about a week later I got it back, now all working. And I still have that receiver, and I still have the original manual. And I noticed when I looked at it not too long ago that there's red crayon markings all through it, on the, not on the schematic, but on the pictorial diagrams of the wirings of the thing. And that was when I remember when I was trying to troubleshoot it without knowing anything about radio. And then it went finally to Mr. Gorgas, who sent it back working.
He helped you in that particular case, but did he become a mentor or an Elmer to you?
No, not at all. He had a son who was also a ham, who I only knew slightly, but, he was a friend of my dad's, and I got the radio back without comment, or I never actually learned what was wrong with it. Unfortunately, wish I'd gotten that.
Did your school have a ham radio club? Were you involved with other kids who were hams?
Well, I remember where I went to school, the 9th grade was part of junior high school, and I remember there talking with a guy who was a science teacher and saying, we ought to have a ham radio club here. I don't think that ever came to anything, but then I switched schools in the next year in 10th grade to the high school, and we did have a radio club there. I've kind of forgotten now, but I think I was part of actually getting that started. There was a teacher there, Mr. Vanka, who was he was a woodshop teacher, and he was a ham, and between him and me and 2 or 3 other students who were also hams, we put together a little radio club.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your further education and career?
Well, in a way, I found that I was so fascinated and interested in radio that I really thought, I enjoy doing this so much. I don't want to do it for work and then come home and think, well, I don't want to do that anymore. So instead of majoring in some form of electrical engineering, I decided that I wanted to study chemistry. And so in college, I majored in chemistry, and that was what actually led to my finding the job back in the area here. I graduated from college in, I think, 1967, and I had a number of job interviews, and I had a couple of job offers. One was from DuPont down in Delaware or Maryland, and I remember having to choose between that and the job that I eventually took, which was at a community college here in town, because I thought I found that I did enjoy teaching, I guess, as it turned out, and I got this job offer from the community college here, and against my dad's advice, who said, "Take the DuPont job. You don't want to be messing around with teaching." But I took the teaching job for about 2/3 of the salary of the DuPont job, and so I was a chemistry teacher for, well, I think it was 17 and a half years that I did that, and had risen in, through the hierarchy of academic rank. And after I'd gone as high as I could with that, for some reason I decided that, I want to try something else now. So I left the teaching job and went to work at IBM and worked there for, about 20 years, I think.
As a chemist?
I worked as an analytical chemist at first. Then when they no longer needed chemists, I worked in software testing, because I'd gotten involved in computers while I was teaching at the college and spent countless hours fiddling with computers, which is another interesting story, but I don't know how relevant that is to.
It's interesting from the standpoint that I think that all the people that I've spoken to over the last 8 years or so, what they plan to do doesn't seem to be what they ended up doing necessarily, and that their jobs kind of morphed based on how the industry morphed. I would imagine, as an analytical chemist at IBM, was this because you were in a factory that produced IBM products and they needed chemists in order to be able to handle anything from like painting metal, or what does a chemist do at a company like IBM?
Well, as an analytical chemist, I worked on projects that really involved troubleshooting when there were production and process problems that the technicians who worked along with a given process couldn't figure out. They would contact. There was a big research and development department, and so they would often come for help with figuring out, what the problem was. There was an interesting one that I distinctly remember, which involved a process that used titanium, a whole bunch of titanium tanks, and printed circuit boards would be dipped in one tank and then another and another. A problem developed. I don't remember exactly what the problem was, but it turned out the problem was hydrochloric acid that had been contaminated with relatively high levels of fluoride. So I was part of the group that traced out the fact that this fluoride was in there, and that caused problems with the titanium used in the tanks.
IBM has morphed into a kind of a knowledge company now. I think they even bought like Red Hat Linux or something like that. But in those days, IBM was a huge producer of products, not only big computers, but remember the IBM Selectric typewriter. Was that from the same group, perhaps, that you were involved in?
No, they didn't make type. I don't know where they made those, but one of the interesting things that they manufactured in Endicott, that's where the plant was where I worked, was check sorters. And check sorters they were still making them when I was there, and these were machines that are impossibly, when you would see one running, you would think this could never possibly work, because they would sort thousands of checks per some unit time. I don't remember what it was now, and it was just amazing to watch the things work. I didn't have anything to do with those, and I never remember working on problems that were associated with them. But that was one of the things manufactured in Endicott, as well as a number of. They made a number of computers here and computer boards and that sort of thing. But I would like to say something more about computers from while I was teaching. While I was teaching, it was at the time that there was a computer called the Altair, and I became fascinated with that and thought I'd like to learn more about that and get one and find some ways to use it in the chemistry department. Well, I ended up buying an IMSI computer.
I remember that one too.
Yeah. Well, that had switches on the front panel, and you could program it.
On the front panel, right? It was an 8-bit computer.
Yeah, it was an 8-bit computer, and I ended up with one of those and developed a lot of applications where you could use those in chemistry, doing acquisition of data. And one of the articles that I wrote for a magazine called Microsystems was using it as a digital voice recorder, where you could record your voice into the 64K of memory that was in the thing, and then play it back out, through an audio amplifier. Doesn't sound like much today.
No, it was a big deal then, I think.
That was a big deal then. I remember giving a presentation at a ham radio club meeting about how I did that.
But that computer, as I recall, CP/M wasn't quite available yet for those computers. So you are actually writing an assembly language?
No. It turned out that from other mentors of mine in the computer business, there was a system called North Star, and they made a floppy disk system that you could use with the IMSI. It would plug in, and it had its own North Star operating system, and that's what I ended up, for the most part, using. Later on, I did get CP/M and got that installed in compilers of Fortran and Pascal and stuff like that.
Well, as I recall, in those days, this would have been probably the late 70s.
Yes, that's right.
Ham radio operators really jumped on the microcomputer bandwagon, probably as early adopters, I think. Don't you think?
Yeah, that's right. I knew a few other hams who were kind of interested in interested in computers, but they came along a little bit later, and at that time there were by then Apple computers, and I think the earliest IBM computers
were in the early 80s, I think.
Yeah, that's when that stuff started.
I think K-Pro was one of the first available computers, and that might have been like 81.
Yeah, that was the suitcase, the Porto computer that you could hardly pick up.
In doing some research, I noticed that during this period of time, you were a frequent contributor to 73 magazine, at least since the early 70s, and you're a current contributor to Electric Radio magazine. For anyone who hasn't seen that magazine, that is a great magazine for people that are interested in old radios and restoring tube-type radios. How did you get started in being a contributor to magazines and sharing the knowledge that you're gaining?
Well, the first articles that I wrote were for 73 magazine, and the one that I remember most clearly was I learned of a radio called the Panasonic RF-2200, which is a classic analog radio and sought after to this day, that had some features that made it usable as a ham receiver, and or at least for shortwave listening. And I was so fascinated with the engineering in that and how well it worked that I wanted to share that, and I did that by writing the article for 73 magazine.
And that radio, did that have like a beat frequency oscillator or something like that so you could actually listen to CW? I mean, was it that good a radio?
Yeah, and the thing about it was, and I remember writing about this, was that throughout its tuning range, you could tune it, I think it had frequency markings every 10 kcs on the dial, so that you could actually tune it to a given frequency and get pretty close. And I remember comparing it to an R390 and its frequency accuracy. It was completely different from the kind of sort of general coverage shortwave radios that you could get at the time, that you could find a band, maybe, a ham band, but maybe not.
Do you have one of those radios in your fleet of radios?
As a matter of fact, I do. I still have my RF-2200. I don't often listen to it on. I use it for FM radio now, but every once in a while I turn it on and or tune it to the shortwave bands and listen on that a little bit. I did find that I enjoyed writing, and it's an iterative process, and it was something that I just kind of liked doing and sharing knowledge that way.
Did it also give you some kind of goals? If you decided you wanted to pursue a piece of equipment for restoration, did you kind of use an article as a way to set a pace?
No, I didn't do that. What I've done with most of the articles that I've written is when I've written about a particular piece of equipment, one that comes to mind is one called the Barlow-Wadley XCR30 receiver. That's not one that many people are familiar with, but that's a receiver that uses what's called a Wadley loop, which is a way that an engineer developed, a South African guy developed in the early 1950s, is a way to compete with, or turned out to compete with Collins receivers, where you could get readout to the nearest KC from, all the way up to 30 megacycles. Well, anyway, it's such an elegant piece of engineering that I decided that, again, I studied that radio for months. I didn't really need to restore the one that I ended up with, but found it such an elegant piece of engineering that I just had to share its workings with other people. You might be familiar with the Yaesu FRG7 or the Radio Shack DX302 or 301. Do you remember those?
I think so.
Yeah, those, it turned out, also used Wadley loops. The FRG7 is another one of those great classic receivers these days. For some reason, people are really taken with it, and I happen to have one of those too. And it's a really elegant piece of engineering. This Wadley receiver was actually manufactured in South Africa sold here. That's unique, I think, in radio equipment. I don't know if they ever made anything else in South Africa that hams in this country ever ended up with.
How did you develop the interest in military surplus radios going back to World War I is when you first got interested in the foxhole radio. But how did you gain an interest in going after the old World War II radios? Was that from that first experience, perhaps, as a kid?
I think it was from that Naval Reserve Center. And what that led to was after I got my license, I had this Heathkit AR3 receiver, which isn't really a very good receiver. It's basically a 5-tube, not an AC-DC, but an AC-powered set. Heathkit wouldn't make AC-DC stuff because it was dangerous, But it turned out there was a small surplus shop in Binghamton, and I ended up going there for some reason, and they had for sale World War II vintage command transmitters and receivers. And I ended up with one of the receivers. It's a model BC-454 command receiver that was used in planes like the B-17 and the B-29 and B-25s and B-24s. And I got that, and, you had to build a power supply for it and so on, and that was a learning experience. But that was the first receiver that I had that was a little, cut above the AR3. And after I bought that, it just sort of continued on along those lines. I found that I was really interested in that receiver, which I still have today. That was the start of my using World War II surplus stuff.
Those receivers, are those also the ARC-V? Do they have the same look and feel?
Yes, the ARC-V were the ones that were used by the Navy, and essentially identical they were called SCR-274. There was a whole radio set called the SCR-274. In fact, SCR stood at the time for set, complete, radio. And later on they changed it to mean signal corps radio. But its initial meaning was set complete radio. And the receivers and transmitters and modulators and control boxes, all of that stuff constituted the SCR-274, or in the Navy, the ARC-V equipment.
ARC-V meant it was the transmitter receiver, the power supply, whatever else. So it was the whole kit, not just a single piece of it.
That's right. That's right. And in the ARC-V series, there was a receiver called the R23. That was what we would call today, or a lot of hams today that knew about such things would call it a Q5er. It was a very low-frequency receiver. And there was an equivalent, essentially identical receiver in the SCR-274 series called the BC-453.
How do you find those radios? At least when you started, probably it was closer to the time and maybe they were in better condition. But how do you find them now? And what kind of condition are they in?
Well, you could find them in anything from pristine condition, which isn't too common, but they still turn up, to pretty well mangled. There was hams in the 50s, especially in the 50s and in the 60s, would take these receivers and modify them the way I modified the one that I had, converting it. There were conversion manuals. There was the surplus conversion manuals, 1, 2, and 3. They had instructions on how to modify them to make them more usable by hams. Those that were converted are today, a lot of them just junk, but a lot of us who are interested in this stuff will take those and unmodify them to put them back in their original condition, in their World War II condition, if it's possible. A lot of them have been, essentially ruined as far as restoring to their completely original condition.
And what does that mean in terms of restoration for you? I mean, will you take it right down to the individual parts and even refashion the chassis in order to put it back into pristine shape?
Yeah, there are things that you can do if it hasn't been, if it hasn't been too modified to put it back in pretty much original condition. One of the big projects that I'd worked on and wrote up in electric radio over a number of series of articles was that, as you are probably aware, in vintage radios, it's the capacitors that typically fail. You know, the dielectrics in them fail and they gradually start to leak and short out, and you need to replace them with modern capacitors. Well, in these command receivers, the company that started building them fashioned unique little metal enclosed cylindrical capacitors, and the original modifiers of them would just take those capacitors out and stick in modern capacitors. But I worked out a way to cut the old original ones open, replace the guts inside, with modern capacitors, and put them back together and reinstall them in the radio. And the techniques that I developed for doing that are so good that I had one of my receivers that I had done that to, and I had to study it really carefully to figure out whether are these ones that have been rebuilt or not. And that's not an exaggeration.
So these are those chassis mount capacitors that had the hole in the chassis, and then they were kind of like they had little tabs that twisted to hold them in place, or maybe they even had screws or bolts that came through the chassis with nuts on them to hold them in place?
Yeah, that's right. These were that latter variety. They were held in place with a couple of screws, a couple of 348 machine screws. When you look under the chassis of one of these receivers, it's just amazingly beautifully laid out and organized and so on. You might look at one of the old electric radios where I had written about that, and you'll see some examples of that. But I developed that process over a period of, several years. A friend of mine who was also likewise interested in this process had come up with one way of doing it, which I really didn't like. And but starting with his idea, I found some alternative ways of doing it, which amounted to, I won't go into the details, but somehow opening up the capacitors so that you could get at the insides without ruining the capacitor itself.
Right, so that it looks stock, even though it's no longer stock.
It's no longer stock. And another little interesting sidelight on that is one of the things I've learned about these receivers is that they originally ran with dynamotor power, which was a little motor generator which sat on the back, and those ran on 28 volts DC from the aircraft, and that motor ran a generator that generated for these receivers 260 volts, and that was then applied, used as the DC for the receiver. What I came to learn over a long period of time is the receivers worked just as well with half that voltage or a third of that voltage down to, 125 volts or so. And more recently, based on another article that I'd written for electric radio, I found that the receivers work quite happily with 28 volts of B plus instead of, the original 260 volts. And one of the consequences of that is they can't produce too much audio power, but the sensitivity of the receiver is about the same. You can hear an antenna noise when you just touch the antenna terminal with one running at that voltage. And of course, the old capacitors, if you have an original, an original pristine one, the capacitors are much happier at 28 volts and will probably last about forever with that low of a B plus voltage.
Even if the dielectric has started to break down?
Even if it started to break down, because, the resistance is pretty high in the dielectric when they start to break down, and when you lower the voltage by an order of magnitude, the current through them, leakage current, drops by that same amount or maybe even more. I learned about that from another article that I've written for electric radio that Ray hasn't published yet, called the BC-1206. That was a World War II vintage radio that was designed to use only 28 volts of B+. There was a special audio tube that was developed for exactly that kind of use that would produce several hundred milliwatts of audio power at 28 volts of B+. Most tubes, when you run them at that low of a B+, won't develop more than a few milliwatts of audio power.
But that was enough to drive a pair of headphones that you would have used on a World War II aircraft because of the noise, right? So
yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. A couple of hundred milliwatts was plenty in a headset.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. What would you say was the biggest restoration challenge that you've had?
Well, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One, I mentioned that flood or the two floods that I'd had about 10 years ago now. And one of the transmitters that I had at the time and still have now was an ART-13. That's a Collins World War II vintage transmitter that was used a little later in the war and used on B-29s, among other airplanes. But that has the famous Collins auto-tune mechanism in it, that's all mechanical. It amounts to 10 channels of memory that are mechanical memories. Well, anyway, my ART-13 was flooded in 2011, and it sat underwater for several days. Well, that was a restoration that took a couple of months. I had brought that with me when I moved to higher ground here and had that on my workbench for a long period of time, cleaning it up. Interestingly, water doesn't really harm electronic components particularly. If it's flooded and you rinse it off and dry it out thoroughly, it doesn't really have any significance. That's different from having a piece of electronic equipment sit for decades, in a damp basement. So anyway, that's one of the major restorations that I did. Another one was a Drake receiver that was likewise flooded. It was a Drake SSR-1. That was one of these Wadley loop receivers that I'd mentioned earlier. And it was flooded. And that's a little solid state thing. It wasn't built by Drake. They were made in Japan. But I decided that, I would like to get that thing to work. And it's small and relatively, convenient to work on. It's all solid-state circuitry, and there's a lot of subtle stuff in it. But I spent a couple of months working on that also. And I did write a piece on electric radio on that called, I think, SSR-1 Rescue, I think the title that was on that.
The flood that you're talking about, was that also in Binghamton?
Well, yeah, that was it. Well, it was in a suburb of Bingham. It was in Binghamton, in the suburb that I lived in called Johnson City, New York.
Would this be called the Johnson City flood then, if somebody was looking it up?
Johnson City flood or Binghamton flood, either one would find out information about that. Both areas were flooded, but where I lived was really, we had 7 feet of water in our driveway, right up to the top of the garage door.
So you sent me pictures of your ham shack, and usually I would ask you, what's your current rig? But from the pictures I sent, I guess you have tens of rigs, if not more. Did that flood all of your radios and test equipment and stuff like? I mean, were you completely underwater?
Well, I had a huge amount an embarrassing amount of equipment at the time that we got flooded. And I ended up getting rid of about 90% of it. But I had the equipment that was in the garage that I think was in the picture that I sent you. Essentially, all of that was flooded. But I had stuff in the upstairs of my house and in another spot that was stuff that didn't get flooded. when I got rid of it, I actually got rid of a lot of the flooded stuff and a lot of the unflooded stuff. And it was about 90%. It was a big truck full of stuff.
Did it go to the dump, or was it recoverable based on the fact it was fresh water, I guess? And
oh yeah, no, none of my stuff ever went to the dump. There's a company that does radio auctions called Estes Auctions, and a crew of 5 guys came after the second flood, and after things were dried out, and my brother and I had cleaned everything up, at least to the first approximation, and they filled up the truck and took it back to Ohio, where they hold the auctions, and auctioned the stuff off over took a couple of years for them to finally auction it all off.
There is a market for this old stuff. I guess anybody that goes to the Dayton Hamfest knows that there appears to be a market for just about everything. It sounds to me like not only World War II radios, but you have, I saw that you've got some Collins transceivers. You have a little bit of everything. Is there something that's your favorite? What would be the most favorite restoration that you've done in terms of what you like to operate?
Well, I think that the ART-13 that I mentioned fits that bill. Every Saturday I have that fired up and on the air, and use it to get on the old military net, which you had alluded to earlier. That's a group of guys who are interested in vintage military equipment, mostly World War II and somewhat post-World War II. And we get on there and run our old military transmitters and receivers and put them to actual use. There was a well-known World War II transmitter, the BC-610. A lot of guys use those. Those are about the size of a refrigerator, and I never wanted anything bigger and heavier than I could pick up and carry. And that's how I ended up with the ART-13.
And what receiver do you use for that net?
I use a companion receiver that was actually used with that during World War II, which is a BC-348. And that's a general coverage receiver. It covers the shortwave frequencies up to, I forget how high, about 20 megacycles, I think. And there's a VLF range, 200 to 400 kcs on it. It doesn't cover the AM broadcast band, but that's the receiver that I use with it.
You mentioned in the pre-show that you also have an interest in frequency meters, and I had mentioned to you that I remember actually working with a technician that had a frequency meter. What is a frequency meter, and what's this article going to be about that you're writing?
Well, frequency meter is an analog way of measuring frequencies that people really had to use before the advent of frequency counters, starting in the in the early 1960s, say. And the way that it works is that if you have a radio signal, say at 3 megacycles, but you don't know exactly what frequency it's on, a frequency meter is a device with a variable frequency oscillator that one way or another has been calibrated so that the variable frequency oscillator, when you set it to a given dial reading, what frequency it's putting out. So if you have a signal, say, at 3 megacycles, and you have a frequency meter and you dial it to exactly the same frequency, as you know, you'll get a beat note between the two if you put them into a mixer. And so you dial the frequency meter so that it's at 0 beat with the unknown signal, and then you can read from the frequency meter dial, typically not the frequency directly, but use a calibration chart to look up the frequency that the VFO is tuned to. So it's a process that takes some effort. During World War II, there were 2 very common ones. One used by the Navy called the model LM, and one used by the Army called the model BC-221. And they were variable frequency oscillators that came with calibration books where for a given frequency like 3885 kilocycles, you could look up that in the calibration book and then set the dial on the frequency meter to that frequency. once you had calibrated the frequency meter itself, which requires beating against a crystal of known, a crystal is stable and produces a reproducible frequency. Frequency meters were first developed back in the 1920s, and the first ones, the later ones were called heterodyne frequency meters. But I ran across an article by a guy named Lampkin, G.F. Lampkin, who had an article in a 1927, I think it was, QST, that where he referred to a heterodyne wavelength meter. And it was the same thing as a frequency meter, but back then people used wavelength more commonly than frequency. And this was a guy who developed this thing a few years later called the Lampkin frequency meter. That was his name, was the company name.
I told you before we started that I actually worked with a ham radio guy that ended up being one of my mentors, Elmer's, when I was probably 19, 20 years old, working in a marine radio service company. He was Harry Wells, W6LYC, and he used a Lampkin frequency meter. And he told me what he liked about it instead of using like a Cushman CE3 or something, or even a frequency counter, is that he could put his hand in the radio and do the tweaking, and he was using his ears to zero beat the transmitter that he was working on without having to take his eyes off of it. So he had his hand in the chassis. He was listening for being on frequency rather than looking up at a frequency counter or something like that. So that seemed to be the reason that he liked it.
Yeah, the way that would work is a transmitter would be on, say 100 megacycles, probably a VHF rig of some sort that he would have been working on. And that the output of the transmitter would mix with the output of the Lampkin frequency meter and produce a beat note. And then, yes, you could do that by ear rather than by eye.
Right. It was unusual because I had seen, growing up, I'd seen people using like the Cushmans or the frequency counters and thought that's the best way to do it. And then I'm watching and working with Harry for that year or so and thinking, this is actually a pretty good way of doing it, especially if you were working in a transmitter that had high voltage. Keep your fingers safe as you're doing the tweaking.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And that is an advantage. In fact, the article that I'm working on now using this Lampkin, I'm taking measurements at 245 megacycles. And the interesting thing about that is that the Lampkin, the variable frequency oscillator in the Lampkin, it runs at about 2 megacycles. And so when you're using it at very high frequencies, you have to use harmonics of the VFO. And the harmonic that I'm using is the 100th harmonic.
And it does it so well.
Well, it's one of the special things about the Lampkin is that the Guy Forrest Lampkin was his name. He developed and wrote an article in QST in the early 1930s about the basic idea of the variable frequency oscillator that's used in this Lampkin frequency meter. It uses a machinist micrometer as well as part of the mechanism. I won't go into more detail than that, but it's a very interesting piece of equipment that. Well, it's the kind of thing that fascinates me, and I think to myself, well, if I'm fascinated by this, there will be some electric radio people who will be too.
And I look forward to the article in Electric Radio Magazine to see the conclusions that you've drawn from it. I also saw that you even like the new radios, the ones that have solid-state devices in it, and that you've actually built a BIT X40. What do you think of the new rigs?
I built the Microbit X40 because I'd read about how they were manufactured in India, and the people who made them were women who were. It was that was work that they used to support themselves, and I thought I'd like to encourage that. And from what I'd read about that particular radio, I thought I'm just going to buy one of these and support them and have a sort of modern radio. One of the interesting things about it was that I bought it, that was shipped from India, and I paid an extra $10 not because I wanted it quicker, but because I wanted to watch the tracking. And the damn thing got here from India to my door in 3 days.
Amazing.
And I still have I printed out the tracking on that just so that I don't forget or think, well, I must have imagined that. But I don't really use it very much, but I was interested in, that comes as an assembled and tested radio, and you have to add the case.
Right. It didn't require going in as deep as you would on a radio restoration.
Yeah, that's right. I also built, as I think you alluded to, I built a K2 and the amplifier that went with the K2 and the automatic antenna tuner.
That's inside the case?
The antenna tuner is a separate thing. I have mine sitting on top of the antenna tuner. And then I liked that so well I bought a K3, but I didn't put that one together.
It came as boards already assembled, the K3.
Yeah, the K3, you could buy it as a sort of partial kit or just wired and tested and all done and ready to plug in, and that's what I did with the K3. One other modern thing that I would like to mention is a really modern radio. It's a software-defined thing. It's a Texan portable receiver. I don't know if you're familiar with Texan equipment.
No, but I will be.
Okay. Yeah, mine is the model, I think it's P368, Papa 368, I think that's right. And it's TECSUN, and they're both either in China or in Korea. But the interesting thing about it is that it'll fit right in your shirt pocket. And it's got a rechargeable battery in it, and you can, it covers AM, FM, shortwave, and it's a wonderful little receiver, and you can just punch up a frequency right on the switches, and it's got a little keypad right on the front. It's an amazing little thing. Although I'm not really particularly interested in the modern software-defined ham gear, but I like this because you can stick it in your pocket and take it with you anywhere.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. What's your favorite operating mode?
CW. I have a CW contact almost every day of the week with a friend of mine, a local friend of mine. We get on for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes almost every day, and then we switch over and yak for a little bit on 6 meters on sideband. But if I'm listening at night, if I want to listen in the ham bands, I typically listen in CW, because if I listen at night on 75 meters, I usually get irritated with all the stuff that you can hear on there that's just awful. So, and you don't hear that down on CW.
But you know that those people on 80 meters have been there for the last 70 years, it seems. I mean, when I used to listen to 80 meters as a kid in the 70s, it seemed that 80 was the same in the evening.
Yeah, well, things may have deteriorated, and maybe they haven't. But much of what I hear on there, it's painful to listen to.
Can I ask you, Joe, why do you think that is? I mean, what is there about 80 meters? Is it the time of day when everyone's home and the band is open, and it seems to be consistently good, at least being open for 1,000 miles all year long? I mean, what is it about 80 meters that creates this forum?
Well, I think it has to do with the propagation, as you say, and also that the antenna will fit on most city lots. Most places you can somehow squeeze in an 80-meter dipole, where on 160 meters, that's hopeless. I've never had a 160-meter dipole. And 40 meters at night, you never know quite what propagation you're going to have. But I don't know what it is about 80 meters single sideband, but there's, stuff that I personally am not interested in listening to. Now, when I work CW, and I'm tuning around at night, the stations that I'm most interested in hearing are ones that are a little wobbly or chirpy or that have a different sound, because you can tell that those are people running vintage rigs. And those are the people that I found I'm most interested in talking with.
Oh, so they have a signature that keys you off to knowing that you might be talking to a fellow radio restorer.
Yeah, somebody running a vintage rig. You can usually tell if you listen that it doesn't sound quite as, well, I won't say stable, but they often have, vintage rigs often have a little bit clues. There are clues there to tell you that it's not some modern rig.
Do you think an FT101 or a TS520 is a vintage rig now?
It's interesting that you asked that. I have an FT101 that I bought new in 1976, probably, and I still think of that as a modern rig, but not many people do, I suppose, at this point.
Both of those radios were fun to operate, both the TS520 and the FT101.
Yeah, well, and they still work nicely. The thing about them is that if you want to change frequency, that can be a lot of work. Whereas with modern gear, you just push a button or two, and there you are. So I use my FT101 just on one frequency. I just leave it on one frequency and use it there. But mine still has the original tubes in it, and it still works very nicely.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now? Have you thought about that?
Well, every time you go to a hamfest, you see the challenge, which is that it's all old guys and hardly any kids. At the last hamfest that I was at, I did I sold a military surplus manual to a guy who was, well, I would still call him a kid. He might not think of himself that way, but quite a young guy. But, that's a real exception these days. And, when I was a kid, radio was new and interesting and exciting, and being able to hear anything on a radio was exciting. Today, that's not the case, and young kids aren't fascinated by the idea of radio, and that's a challenge.
Isn't that funny? The episode that precedes this, I'm actually interviewing a couple of younger guys, younger right around 20, and that was actually quite a thrill for me. But what was interesting, when I think of radio, and I'm 65, I just think it's magic. I know how it works. I remember when cellular telephones were coming out, and I heard my first cellular telephone conversation from Death Valley, and I'm thinking, oh, I know how that works, but it's still magic. Do you have that same sense that it's still magic even though you know how it works?
Oh, yeah. In fact, one of the things, the ways I think about it is I can imagine, here's a flashlight bulb. Well, I think, of course, it's an incandescent flashlight bulb, and the little bit of power that's in that, and that same amount of power at radio frequencies can send a signal who knows where. And that, to me, that's, to this day, that's just endlessly fascinating. Now, I have to make a comment about cellular phones. I'm a member of the Antique Wireless Association. That's a group that are interested in old radio stuff. And they have in their museum that's located up near Rochester, New York, a Motorola cellular telephone, which is the first.
The portable, the white portable with the big black antenna.
Well, I don't remember. This one is like a prototype.
Okay.
That they built. They invented cellular phones there, and this is the first one that they made. I think this was probably a commercial one, but it was the first commercial cellular phone. And when I first saw that, I thought, why do they have that here at the Antique Wireless Association Museum? But I've grown to appreciate it. And when I've been at the museum, I always stop and take a look at that.
What's interesting about that, though, Joe, is that those phones, there's no systems left that those phones will work on. The systems aren't backwards compatible to the original equipment.
Yeah, that's right. And that's I don't know how far back it was that was invented. It must be 30 years ago by now, maybe more than that. Interestingly, I only have a cellular phone because my wife makes me have it. And mine is it's called a flip phone.
Sure.
You may remember those. Well, I'm getting messages periodically on mine now that this is, I think it's 3G, and they're discontinuing that as of the end of the year, so I'm going to have to get something different.
There are LTE flip phones for older people that are out on the market now, so you can still have a flip phone that works on the new technology.
Yeah, well, all I'm interested in, I don't care whether it's a flip phone or not, but I want it to fit easily in my shirt pocket. My wife has a modern one, and that thing is much larger than what I've got.
Right, and it hurts a lot more when it hits the ground as it falls out of your shirt pocket.
Oh, yeah. Hers has a crack in the screen, I know.
At $1,000 or whatever those things cost, that's a much more painful drop than a flip phone. You know, it's funny, I was showing my granddaughters. My grandchildren are growing up in a home where they don't have any kind of electronics. They have a phone, and so my job every once in a while is to replace the telephone jack that for some reason keeps getting torn off the wall. So I'm there with the butt set, a lineman's handset. I've been working on telephones all my life since I was a little kid, so I have all of the telephone company equipment that you use to maintain telephone lines. I'm showing them the butt set, and they were playing with the switches, and they saw the dial pulses. So the butt set can simulate a pulse dial phone. And so I was trying to explain this to the kids, what this did and how this worked. And surprisingly, the phone system in Israel, and probably in America too, is backwards compatible all the way to dial phones. So you can actually put a dial phone on a modern phone line, and it still works. When they were hearing the click, 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 they kind of got what was happening. But what was kind of eye-opening was how surprised they kind of had this sense of wonder playing with this butt set on their phone line and calling their friends with these dial clicks.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that and kids being interested in that. And I have a couple of antique telephones here, 1925 one that has a real thin little neck on it. And I've always wanted a candlestick phone with a dial on it, but I've never found one of those. But yeah, this phone system that I have some couple of antique phones hooked up to it. And as you say, mine is done over fiber optic cable, but it's all backwards compatible.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, I think that's pretty neat. I'm sure the phone companies didn't want to do that, but somebody made them do that.
Yeah, they were tariffed.
Oh, yes.
I always look on eBay, probably once every few months I look on eBay to see if there's a Western Electric telephone that I can have sent here so that I can put on the desk, and when the grandchildren come, they can look at it and say, oh, well, what is this? And I think, after demonstrating the butt set, they actually might get it and might figure out how to call their friends using it.
With an actual dial. Wouldn't that be great?
Maybe I'll take it over there. That'll give them even more of a thrill. They can use it from their house and call their friends with it. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Well, I'm not sure that there's much that I'm excited about. I'm not interested in contesting or DXing or any of that kind of stuff. I guess one of the things is that there are clubs and places like the Antique Wireless Association that are trying to do things to interest kids in ham radio, and I think that's nice. I can't say that I've done a lot to further that, but it's something that I think is positive. I have encouraged a few people to learn and use CW. People that are older and for some reason that I can't fathom find it an interesting mode. But yeah, clubs trying to interest kids in ham radio, I think, is a positive thing.
I think we'll learn as we spend more time with kids that perhaps our value propositions are wrong. We look at ham radio through a lens that's completely different from the younger generation. Surprisingly, though, when I talk to kids that are active, they actually like CW, surprisingly.
Yeah, well, that's always nice to hear. I've been using CW for 60 years, and I find that when I am working somebody on CW, I don't think of it as anything other than like a language. It's just you hear the noise and there's the meaning right in your head without thinking about it in any way at all.
That's the way it should be. as a language. Do you have advice that you'd give to new or returning hams?
Yes, I would say to get out and try HF rather than fiddling around with 2 meters and repeaters. I have to admit that I've never been terribly interested in using 2 meters, except at a ham fest, as a walkie-talkie to talk to other hams. But I think a lot of new hams, at least, never get any further than using a repeater and a 2-meter handheld rig. And there's so much more to ham radio than that.
Do you think that we're missing an opportunity when hams take the test and we may not follow up with them once they've passed the...
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, there was a woman who took a test at a ham club meeting that I happened to attend, and she passed, and she got her license within, I guess about instantaneously these days when you pass a test. It doesn't take long at all. And one of the things that I did was, I really didn't know her, I just met her, but I sent her one of my QSL cards in the mail, and then I communicated with her several times by email, and she was at the last this couple of months ago, field days, where I was there operating, and she came and sat down with me and the guy that I was with, and she's been trying to learn CW, and she's not very, she couldn't handle anything like the speed that we were using, but she ran the computer that did the logging stuff, and I showed her how she could, in fact, copy some of the really high-speed stuff just by repetition. So, yes, encouraging hams is a very important thing, I think. You get a license and nobody ever seeks you out or gives you advice, then you're very likely to drop out.
I agree with you. I think, at least for me, my mentors and Elmer's made a big difference in terms of my being able to stay in the hobby as long as I have. Joe, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I know it was, I think, a long time coming, but it was really worth it. I'm so glad that you were able to spend this time and tell us about your ham radio life. So with that, I want to wish you thank you very much, and 73.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, and I do want to mention your persistence. You had to keep after me for several years to get me to do this, and I'm glad now that I did.
Well, thank you so much. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Joe. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA2EJT in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I am updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.